And now it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome the panel with our prestigious heads of states. It will be an interactive session. And in alphabetic order, we will have President Julius Maada, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta from Kenya, His Excellency Mahamadou Issoufou from Niger, His Excellency Alassane Ouattara from Côte d'Ivoire, and His Excellency Macky Sall, President of Senegal. So here comes the panel. President Issoufou, if you will allow me, I will begin with you. As President of ECOWAS, African countries are showing their resiliency to overcome this crisis, but they can only count on themselves, whereas the rest of the world has also been affected. But the most recent virtual summit of ECOWAS has shown that you are united. How does this change the way in which the continent is managing its current health policy? Well, I would like to thank you, Richard Attias, for having organized this panel, and I would like to greet all the heads of state who are taking part in it. It is true that the African continent is faced with this global health crisis, but for the time being, Africa has 0.42% of mortality linked to COVID in the world, whereas the population of the continent represents 17% of world population. Several factors explain the resiliency shown by Africa in this crisis. Maybe some immunity due to the fact that we have the presence of viral and infectious diseases in Africa. Others say that there are other factors at play, the climate or the youthfulness of the population, but also the fact that Africa is somewhat outside of global circuits, since we only represent 2% of global trade. Be that as it may, research and studies will try to study all of this in the future. But the measures of isolation cannot, in and of themselves, explain our resilience, since developed countries have not been spared. African countries have understood that we need to put the premium on the fight against COVID. We organized conferences of heads of states at the level of ECOWAS and African Union, and several recommendations were made, including a solidarity fund for the African Union for health, the strengthening of cooperation between the continental body on epidemics, the CDC, and the regional institutions dealing with health issues. We have also strengthened cooperation between member states in terms of research, training, and the exchange of experience in health writ large, and more specifically in terms of the fight against COVID-19. And in this fight against the pandemic, international solidarity, I do believe, more than ever becomes necessary. And issues such as access to water and basic health care should be of the utmost importance and should be considered as matters pertaining to human rights. But for the time being, Africa has shown its resiliency, this despite the fact that some of those had predicted that the continent would collapse faced with this health crisis. Thank you, President Issoufou. President Macky Sall. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. You, a few weeks ago, you were one of the first to take the floor, and you raised a very important concept that you called a new world order. Can you discuss this with us, Mr. President?
Je vous remercie, Richard.
Thank you, Richard, first for having organized this very important discussion, and I thank the New York Forum Institute, and I greet my colleagues who are taking part in this panel with me today. I would also like to thank the Economic Commission for Africa, which is working with our ministers, as well as the African Union, through the task force that was set up to deal with the issue of debt cancellation for Africa. And the conclusion is unanimous. This crisis, this pandemic of COVID-19 has shown that whatever the development level of countries, be they G20 countries or countries of the G7 even, African countries or developing countries, we have not found the appropriate responses. We were all caught by surprise by the scope of the pandemic. And despite the scientific progress, despite the wealth of our world, the health systems globally were not up to the task, or at the very least, were not capable of stemming the consequences of the disease. And this should lead us to think about our development models, because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We consider that despite the sizable financing, which is the levels of the finance, the global finance, billions of dollars a day, humanity was not capable of developing solidarity amongst countries, despite the calls and despite the behavior of Africa, and President Issoufou has just mentioned this, without very important means, Africa was able nonetheless to show its resiliency in terms of the number of people contaminated and the mortality rate. Clearly, there are still things that we don't know about the virus. We don't fully understand the resiliency of the continent. It's clearly a combination of factors. But despite all the efforts at the outset of the G20 to go towards pardoning of bilateral debt, that was the first step, but it was insufficient. When faced with the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. And it's at this level that we continue to request more solidarity for a new world order based on human values, based on solidarity, international solidarity. And I have to say that as I'm speaking to you, I find myself a little bit saddened to note that actually the pandemic did not lead humanity to draw real lessons. Today, you have countries who are fully capable of saying, we will find $1 billion, we will find $2 billion. And just wanting to find these resources, they do. And other countries such as ours, despite our efforts, we are not able today to find $2 or $3 billion in order to face not only the health response, because we are daily in this fight, day and night, in order to contain the disease. But we are not able to ensure the protection for our businesses and to protect jobs. So there is a certain unfairness. And we see that COVID-19 is just exacerbating the unfairness, and the international system needs to change. And so I'm pleading for a global renewal based on more social fairness, because what we are still living is the consequences of an economic model stemming from World War II. And everything was built on this model, whereas from a time when Africa was not independent, today 1,300,000,000 Africans, what will we do when there is a vaccine? And the countries that will discover this vaccine will not accept to share this vaccine for all of us. So we are also requesting that this vaccine, whatever the country that develops this, be made available to Africa and the rest of humanity. So I want to place ourselves in terms of a new vision based on a new solidarity, new values, a new world, and we want to continue our combat, each country today, in order to stem the disease and contain it, and to avoid its mortality. Thank you, President Macky Sall. We will come back on all of these topics, which are essential, but I would now like to ask a question of President Ouattara. Your Excellency, your government announced a response plan for COVID-19. To what extent does this plan ensure the protection of the more vulnerable and contain the economic crisis that has been forecasted? Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, all my friends, all my brothers and sisters who are with us today. I want to thank you. And I had difficulties to hear Richard before, but I'm delighted to see him, and I have heard what my brothers Issoufou and President Sall have had to say, and we fully agree. And as regarding Côte d'Ivoire and the plan that we have implemented, well, very quickly we set up our response plan, and a plan for economic, social, and humanitarian support. And I believe that the essential thing for all of our countries was to respond very quickly. Around March 2nd, we had our first cases, and in March 23rd, we had 25 cases and a population of 25 million. We responded and set up our response plan, and we ordered all the required equipment, hand sanitizers, face masks, and everything that we needed to protect ourselves. And immediately thereafter, the government implemented its response and support plan. It's an economic, social, and humanitarian response to the tune of $3 billion, which is a sizable amount. It represents 5% of our GDP. And this plan was quickly brought to bear thanks to international solidarity and the support of international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF and the African Development Bank, as well as bilateral donors. And I thank them all for their support. And as President Macky Sall was saying, we believe more should be done. And this leads me to a comment. For decades, I myself was working for international institutions, and we all insisted that industrial countries devote 0.7% of their GDP to support developing countries. And with this country, we see that all of these countries can devote 5, 6, 7% of their GDP to respond to the pandemic. I believe that there is a lesson to be learned there from this situation, which is to say that there is a certain selfishness which, since for decades, since our independence, developing countries have been requested this 0.7%, but this was never reached. Even the more generous countries only did have 0.35%. But it's not to say that we want to beg. What we are asking for is to have the right conditions at the international level to support us when it comes to overcoming our issues. For Côte d'Ivoire, the first results give us hope. The mortality rate is between 1 and 1.5%, 25 deaths so far, and 53% of positive people tested who are positive, and more than 50% of them have been cured. We have no curfew to date, so we have all of our activities going on, be it school, restaurants, hotels. On all our country, everything is functioning. 100% of the cases today are in Abidjan. Since April 21st, we have had no cases outside or in the hinterland. So we have isolated Abidjan in order to be able to overcome this issue. President Ouattara, one brief question as well. As Côte d'Ivoire, you are one of the defenders or one of the champions for food production, and you want to play a greater role in food production. We have had no issues in terms of food production. Côte d'Ivoire has always been an agricultural country, which is why we quickly close our borders in order to, or close the rest of the country from Abidjan to protect our agriculture. That's the most important. And this worked well. We today have had no issue of food insecurity. So there's no regional risk of food security that was forecasted. Well, of course, for the sub-region, we could fear some issues, but we have maintained our closures along the border, be it air, land, and sea. But for goods, for trade, things are still circulating. So we do have the possibility. And we are grateful to our neighboring countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. They continue to supply us, and we continue to supply them. So as regards Côte d'Ivoire, no issues there. And for the sub-regions, yes, there are a few concerns, and the continent, of course, experts are there to say this, that the prospects are quite dire indeed. Thank you. So I don't want to go into details, but we do have plans on each of the main topics. A solidarity plan to the tune of $285 billion, a plan to support our major companies for $165 billion, a support plan for the SMEs for $250 billion, and a fund to support the informal sector, because you see, in our country, the informal sector has been the most affected by the closure of small restaurants and markets. And we have a fund for $160 billion and a special fund for the agriculture sector to help them. And this goes back to the question that you raised, because we want to maintain our resiliency of our agricultural sector. So things are going well, and our growth rate before the pandemic was estimated by the Bretton Woods institutions at over 7%, and we believe that we will be between 3 and 4% of growth rate, this despite the pandemic. Thank you, President. We'll come back in a few moments on other topics.
Thank you for your patience. You recently urged African countries to collaborate more to overcome this crisis. So concretely, how can African countries increase information and resource sharing, in your opinion?
Well, first and foremost, I want to take this opportunity to join my colleagues and to thank them all for participating and send my greetings, as well as yourself, Richard, for organizing this forum. But let me begin by saying that it is quite clear to me and to many of my colleagues across the African continent that our success in defeating this particular disease is going to be based both on our individual country responses, but more importantly, on our collective response as a continent, because that ultimately, given the porous nature of our borders, we need each other in order to overcome this particular problem. Let me go further and say that we have had very encouraging dialogue under the chairmanship of Cyril Ramaphosa, who is our current AU chair, where we have been exchanging ideas and possibilities, first and foremost on what we ourselves as a continent can do, and also equally joining together to see how we can get the international community to mobilize support, not necessarily just for individual countries, but for the continent as a whole. As I'm sure you are aware, we ourselves have tried to mobilize the limited resources that we have to develop a joint position. We have put money as Africa to our Africa CDC Center in Addis Ababa. We have also equally contributed towards trying to ensure that we, as a country and as a continent, are able to share the resources that we individually can do, be they PPPs, be they masks. How can we share the limited resources we have, not only within our own populations, but across the African continent? But ultimately, this is a problem that Africa alone will not be able to defeat. I continue to emphasize this is a problem that was not created by Africa, but has the greatest chance of hurting Africa more than any other part of the world. So the international community itself also has an obligation to support this continent of ours in our endeavor to defeat this disease. And we are also appealing that this is not the time for blame game. This is the time to reach, find solutions, find the vaccines, get the economies open. Our countries are today, much more than ever before, dependent on the global economy. And the continued shutdown has affected many of our diverse industries where our bread and butter as a continent is, be it in Kenya, horticulture, tourism, be it mining in other countries. All these are industries that have hurt us. So we are not only faced with the problem of corona, we are also faced with a severe problem of underdeveloped economies, joblessness, but also the ravages of climate change, and as is happening currently in Kenya, now of severe floods. So let me just say that to win, it must be a partnership. To win, we must change the way we think. To win, we must change our approach to humanity. Richard, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. President Bio, thank you for being with us. Your country was one of the most affected by the Ebola epidemic earlier this decade. So this was an occasion, if I can say, for the African continent to learn many lessons. So how are they helping you to deal today with this crisis?
Thank you, Richard. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. COVID has kept us apart, but through this technology, we are able to see one another and discuss the way forward out of COVID. Definitely, we suffered quite a lot with Ebola, and we were able to learn lessons as a result. And we have used that to bring to bear on the current situation. Before, we did not get any case of COVID in Sierra Leone until March 31st. That is because once we heard about it elsewhere, we took measures to control entrance into Sierra Leone. We didn't close our borders, but we are very vigilant in terms of monitoring everybody that came in. We immediately put in a quarantine system, a whole set of protocols to make sure that those who are coming in had to stay off from mingling with the rest of the public for at least 14 days before we allow them to go out, whether they were Sierra Leoneans or other nationals. So our first defense was actually to prevent any incident of COVID in Sierra Leone, and we did that right around all the ports of entrance into Sierra Leone, and for that is how we are able to keep Corona out of Sierra Leone for a very long time. Once we had our index case, our next move was what do we do to make sure it doesn't spread? And if it was going to spread, what would be our best effort to really reduce the speed of its spread as it has happened elsewhere? So from learning again from our past experience with Ebola, we immediately put in place measures to prevent it from moving out of Freetown, that is the capital city, into the other areas. Different measures, most of which have been mentioned by some of my colleagues and known around the world. We put all of those measures into place to reduce the speed. Of course, with different modes of transmission, it has been going around. At the moment, we have tested about 4,000 people, and the average number of tests per day now is between 150 and 170. We have had 534 cases, and we have only 33 deaths at the moment, and we are still putting together. What we did was, from Ebola, all those who had worked in terms of contact tracing, surveillance, we lost quite a lot of our medical doctors during the fight against Ebola. The remainder we were able to bring together, we put together a national structure. And from Ebola, one of the lessons we learned for just like coronavirus, without a vaccine and medication, the best medication is awareness among the population. Everybody knowing that this is the biology of this particular virus and the mode of transmission. Right across the country, everybody should know how to prevent being in touch with contact with anybody who has contracted the virus, and how we can stop it spreading. That is the best, that is the only medication in the absence of any correct biomedical intervention at this moment. So social mobilization is a great weapon in addition to other measures. Everybody working to make sure that they don't spread the disease. So the bitter lessons of Ebola has taught us quite a lot of taught us lessons that we were able to bring to bear on the situation. And we still have technical expertise within the country, which we were able to mobilize very quickly. So far, we have been able to really relatively contain the virus. Of course, it is spreading, but our move now is to make sure we slow and break the circuit of transmission and make sure that we get rid of it. Of course, it's a fight for lives and also fight for livelihoods, which is quite difficult, taking into consideration our economic and social situation. So some of the measures that have been used elsewhere, we have been finding difficult to use, and we have been really very circumspect not to use what others have used just because they are being used elsewhere, like complete lockdown, that hard lockdown when nobody comes out. It is not possible here. And what we have done is inter-district, and we have curfew to reduce the time for interaction among huge numbers of people. And so far, we have been relatively successful using the experience we've had and also the expertise. And that is how we've been able actually to control the virus so far.
Thank you, Mr. President. Monsieur le Président Issoufou,
President Issoufou, I would like to come back to you on an important topic. Despite the pandemic and the ceasefire raised by the UN Secretary General, the security risks remain very important on the African continent. How does the pandemic affect, and can you discuss the security situation in Sahel briefly? Is the question to me? Yes, President. So the question is to me, Richard. Yes. Yes, President Issoufou. Thank you very much. Others can respond as well, of course. Richard, allow me, before answering this question on security, to make a comment on the new paradigm that we need to see after this pandemic. Globalization has really done away with distances, so all conditions are there for what we can call the butterfly effect, which is to say small causes that produce large-scale consequences, as proves the current health crisis. COVID reminds us of the fact that we have a common destiny, and this should lead us to think about the implementation of a new paradigm, which supposes a new political and economic governance, more democracy, the acceleration of political and economic integration of the African continent, and stronger democratic institutions capable of promoting good governance in the various countries of the continent. These, I believe, are major issues that should feed our debate at the continental as well as at the global level, this debate should no longer be avoided. We can no longer avoid the issues of reform, for example, of the UN institutions, including those of the Security Council. We can no longer avoid the discussion on the inequities and the need for a new sharing of wealth at the global level and at the level of each country. This debate has employed generations of economists, but it's really not a technical discussion, it's more a political one. And there is a US economist, Simon Kuznets, who defended the topic according to which inequities are accentuated during the first phases of industrialization, and that they would spontaneously decrease as development continues. And this was said to us during the Cold War to keep developing countries in the orbit of the West, but actually nothing is spontaneous. Necessarily, we need to organize ourselves to fight against inequity, to conceive and implement the post-COVID-19 paradigm. This new paradigm, to my mind, should be focused not only on the fight against inequities, but also on the climate challenge, because the current model, and President Macky Sall has said this before, is attacking nature, but we have not inherited the earth from our ancestors. No, we're only borrowing it from our children. So the new paradigm should allow Africa to mobilize the necessary financial resources to allow us to overcome poverty. And we need to be brave in our actions. We need to first promote the capacity of African countries to mobilize more domestic resources, more taxation, to reach 24% of GDP. This compared to less than 20% in a lot of African countries today. We also need to promote direct foreign investment. We need to mobilize resources from the African diaspora. And President Ouattara mentioned this. Developed countries need to keep their promises made during the 70s to allow foreign aid to reach 0.7% of GDP, which is quite low if we compare this to the level of funding brought to bear by the United States in the framework of the Marshall Plan to the reconstruction of Europe. It was 4% of the GDP of the United States for 5 years devoted to the reconstruction of Africa. And you can see that compared to 0.7%, the levels of the Marshall Plan were much higher. And President Macky Sall also mentioned this. We need to forgive the debt of the African continent, promoting various values: dignity, freedom, solidarity, equity, fairness. These are the values, I do believe, that should be the basis of the new paradigm. And in order to come back to security, if you allow, and to come back to the question you were raising, we know that the African Union set itself 2020 a goal of a ceasefire for 2020, which was part of our plan, continental plan. And we are aware of the link between security and development. But the health crisis today has socioeconomic consequences. Unemployment, increase in poverty, including the people going hungry. So it will have clear consequences in terms of security. But currently, for Sahel at least, this crisis has not had consequences on the development of the military operations carried out by the G5 Sahel, the Barkhane forces, and the National Armed Forces, as well as the MJTF in Sahel, in what we call the northern area along the three borders, and in the Lake Chad Basin. Our defense and security forces are more and more overcoming terrorists. The implementation of the Sahel Coalition to fight terrorism, decided on January 13th by the G5 Sahel and France, will allow us to continue this trend through launching the Takuba operation, which will be made up of the European Special Forces, as well as the launching of the Special Forces of ECOWAS and the African Union. We also hope for the participation of more countries to the Sahel Coalition, which is based around 4 pillars: bolstering the fight against terrorism, building up military capabilities of the G5 Sahel countries, coming back to the areas controlled by terrorists currently, and social and economic development. And Richard, I'm taking advantage of this opportunity to make an appeal to solidarity in favor of Sahel, which will have a triple crisis: security, health, and economic. So there will be real consequences in terms of security, and so we need to continue to face these. Thank you, President. President Macky Sall and President Ouattara. President Macky Sall, can you hear me? Yes, says President Sall. In terms of debt, according to you, what should we do in terms of private commercial debt? And what should we do in terms of public debt? I would like to have your impressions, President Macky Sall, and the same goes to President Ouattara and President Kenyatta.
About what should be done for the public debt and the commercial debt for Africa. Monsieur le Président Macky Sall.
President Macky Sall. Thank you very much, Richard. Before discussing this issue, I want to come back to national considerations and say to you that to date, we have a total number of people who tested positive, 2,617 in Senegal. 1,133 were cured. We have 1,450 who are still under care. We are in a similar situation as other African countries, and we have launched a national social and economic plan with a fund of 1 billion CFA francs to support our social support to households, as well as macroeconomic stability with the support to the business sector and the protection of jobs. We also have strengthened our macroeconomic situation through innovating fiscal measures and injecting liquidity with the support from banks. And we have secured the strategic stocks of country, be it food stocks or oil. We have some concerns in terms of what we will do if the crisis goes on and on. We don't have the self-sufficiency that Côte d'Ivoire has in terms of food. We are large consumers of rice, and we are self-sufficient only for 70% of our consumption. So we need to be prepared to ensure the supply if the crisis were to continue in Asia. Regarding the debt and what was said, I also have to tip my hat to the Monetary Fund and the World Bank, because their response was immediate with the implementation of various mechanisms, including special drawing rights for the countries. This was not enough, and after thanking these institutions for what they have done, we need to continue these efforts in order to ensure a pardon of bilateral debt. This might take some time, but while we wait, we need to keep in mind that the level of bilateral debt for Africa, of sub-Saharan Africa, represents less than 2% of the resources that were mobilized during this pandemic for the G20 countries. So you can see the proportion here, less than 2%. And we need to be innovating in terms of commercial debt, because it's at that level, at the level of private debt, that efforts should be carried out in order to help our countries, in order to ensure that they are capable, of course, to reimburse this debt, but that they have more budgetary space to allow them to continue their health response, which needs to continue. We need to carry out the tests at a larger scale, take care of those who are sick, isolate all these people. And all of this costs a lot. We need equipment, and so I don't need to dwell on this. But we need to be innovating, and the African group is thinking about a mechanism that could be set up, and this could benefit from the support or the guarantee of partner countries, for example, of the European Union, and also the mechanisms of the European Union. And we could also use our special drawing rights in order to give the guarantees to this vehicle, which could buy back the commercial debt and restructure it so that the countries will have longer maturities, debt over 15, 20, 25 years, and this could be reimbursed at much lower rates, 2 to 4%, because this contrary to the rates that we're currently getting with Eurobonds. So that's what we're requesting. We just need more solidarity, and we need a new state of mind, and we need to understand that we can't move ahead in isolation. The virus respects no international border. The virus needs no visa to go to the United States, Europe, or Africa. And on this basis, we have a common destiny, and I am convinced that if we consider the real economy, the economy that allows us to invest more in agriculture, food production, for example, for our planet, in sustainable energy to protect our climate, in healthcare infrastructure to have an appropriate response for our humanity, and devote more to education and training, to have a really meaningful development that puts man at its core, and human rights. This is the issue. In terms of debt, contributions can be made, and Africans are resilient. Believe me, Africans are not lazy, contrary to an idea that some might have. Africans work more than others, but they earn much less. They are in the fields, they are in factories, and they are working, but they are unfairly subjected to the consequences of globalization. And we see this in terms of climate. We pollute the less, but we are the most subjected to the consequences of climate change. And it's the same thing economically. Major economies have resources to allow them to overcome this crisis. But what will we do after COVID-19? The consequences will be much more dramatic than the health consequences. What means will we have at hand in order to support our airlines, to support our tourism industry, which is one of the cash cows for countries such as Senegal? Everything is closed and will continue for weeks to come. So we need to invent together mechanisms for more equity that will allow Africa to have room to breathe to face this better. Thank you, President. President Ouattara, do you want to respond to this issue of the debt?
I would like also to get your view on the debt issue, which is a very important one. Monsieur le Président Ouattara.
President Ouattara. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Of course, the issue of debt. I first want to congratulate myself of the initiative of the African Union and of appointing experts such as my brother Tidiane Ngozi and others who are working on this issue and who have expertise that is world-class. And I believe that their discussions and their efforts will bring to bear solutions. And I come back to say that in terms of international aid, we have here an opportunity with this crisis to have a new starting point, and that countries can easily respect this level of 0.7%. They have shown this by reaching 5-6% of GDP in their response to the pandemic. So we need more solidarity regarding debt, multilateral debt, and I am delighted of the initiatives taken by the powers that be. Kristalina Georgieva, David Matas, and my young brother Akin of the African Development Bank and others, who have mobilized exceptional resources and who are trying to set up specific mechanisms in order to help African countries, amongst others. But of course, we have the issue of private debt, commercial debt, and this debt needs to be dealt with expeditiously. We have to borrow on international markets, and our interest rates, to our mind, are too high. Côte d'Ivoire has excellent macroeconomic criteria, much better than many European countries. But when we go to international markets, we have to borrow at 6%. But in Europe, these countries borrow at 1.5% or less even. So there needs to be more recognition of our stability and of the security in our countries, which is why personally I am mindful of our economic framework. And in Côte d'Ivoire, we have a very solid and stable economic framework, which has sizable initiatives. After this crisis, we will reach growth rates of 8-9% for the decade to come. So I wanted to insist that more efforts need to be made. These are important issues in terms of commercial debt, and I have full trust in the expert group set up by the African Union to help find us solutions with our creditors.
President Kenyatta, what is your personal opinion on the debt issue, which is a crucial one?
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I just want to join President Macky Sall by thanking the Bretton Woods institutions, especially the IMF and the World Bank, for the very quick manner in which they responded to this disaster, acted and intervened on behalf of many African countries and many of the less developed countries across the world. But let me also say that we also need to be able to get a proper understanding, because I believe there is a huge misconception about this issue of debt. Africa has taken on this debt, and the debt that we have, be it public or commercial, with the primary purpose of developing weak infrastructure, from health to roads to power, in order to be able to create sustainable economies, economies that can create jobs for our young men and women. And I believe, and it can be laid to witness that as a result of a lot of this kind of investment, we have seen the growth patterns in Africa increase from very, very, very low 1-2 percentage points to many, and the largest number of countries that were recording the highest, among the highest economic growth rates in the globe, were found here on the African continent as a result of that investment. Now here we are, made the investment. We are now faced with challenges that are global challenges, that are really not African-made, that have now resulted in our economies beginning once again to stagnate. And what we're saying is that this is an opportunity for the international community to be able to understand the continent and to be able to say, well, how can we be of assistance to these countries that are struggling to create not only growth, but also create employment and create social impact in terms of health, education, and other areas. And the only way to do so is to help us. As we were growing, we were able to sustain and to pay our debts. Now, with the shrinkage that has occurred in tourism and in all many other sectors, from the commodities that we export, the oil, the coffee, the tea, the cocoa, the other industries that we have been involved in, we were able to pay, and we were paying regularly. But now we have been hit by something, like I said, has not come out of the African continent, but has come from the outside. We now need fiscal space, not only to protect the health of our people, but to also ensure that those who have lost jobs are able to have a social safety net. This is the time for the world to come in and say, let us give Africa this space. Help them, give them enough opportunity to create the fiscal space in order to meet the social needs. And once we are again back on our feet, we shall be able to once again move forward. So in line with the theme of this meeting, I believe that this is the time that the world needs to look at each other in very different circumstances. We are not begging this time. We are saying, give us the necessary fiscal space in order for us to be able to cater for our people, in order for us to be able to sustain our economies, in order for us to be part of the global community. This is not a handout. This is support based on a crisis that was not created on the African continent. So I believe that this is the opportunity for the world to come to the fore and show that they and us can be partners for the future of humanity.
Thank you, President Kenyatta. President Pio, are you aligned with what your peers just said?
Sure, definitely. Africa has always been at the receiving end of most of what happens around the world. We have been making progress, as my colleague just said, and that progress again has been disrupted by COVID. We don't have the quantum of money to create the sort of economic packages, economic stimulus packages that are being bandied around the world. At least if we can be given the opportunity to stay, not to pay off on these debts, or if we can, I think, really be radical, talk about the cancellation of this debt, I think that would be a great service. And it will actually show that we are committed to making sure that the world, there is inclusion, that what we've been talking about for everybody, that Africa also is included in the process of developing. We don't want to be at the receiving end. And again, we have had to, we are dealing with COVID, and it's definitely going to have a great impact on our economies, weak as they are, but we have been making some effort. So I am totally aligned with the views expressed by my colleagues. And I think that is what we have to do if the world is to show solidarity with Africa in this fight against COVID, and the sort of resilience we need to build in our systems if we are going to make progress and restart our economies immediately after COVID.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we go to our conclusion, I would like just to share with you a very short video. We asked some young people, as you know, Africa is about our young people, and they want to have a voice, and they have, I think, some highlights, some questions that they would like to address. So I would like to share with you what some African young talent just told us a few days ago. Please, let's watch together this short video.
In most African countries, businesses, startups, and small businesses owned by young people has been closed down. And to continue to work, they will need a capital. So how are the government going to ensure that the financial system are supporting and easing the access of funds to those businesses?
With schools around the continent now closed, many children and their families, especially those in disadvantaged communities, are in a difficult situation. How will you ensure, or how are you ensuring that all children continue to have access to education and learning?
We have seen many digital initiatives by Senegalese young people for distribution, for information campaigns, as well as online testing. How did you assess this support from the population, and do you believe that one day we can be integrated in terms of our response to pandemics or major risks for our country? So time is of the essence, but we need to answer one important question: education.
So I hope you will get the sound from me. Là, apparemment, le son arrive. Thank you. C'est malheureusement.
We are having sound issues, and this allows me. This is why I hope that we will have physical meetings rather than virtual ones.
The physical event will be back soon, because this world of virtual is okay, but I don't think this is our destiny. So anyway, how do you react?
How do you react in terms of education? Africa needs to be even more connected. We don't all have computers in rural areas.
How do you deal with online education in this current time? Who wants to answer? Qui veut répondre?
Who wants to answer first to this issue of education? President Macky Sall. Thank you, Richard. Education is a cross-cutting issue which is fundamental for our society's development. In Senegal, we have considered that we need a change in paradigm in terms of education, and we have oriented our students much more towards scientific training and technical training, but also towards professional training, because the world has changed around us, and Africa needs to be able to be better connected and integrated to the global economy. New technologies will have to be present in our daily lives. So, in Senegal, we have roughly 75% of high school students that are studying literature, and starting in primary school, we are trying to create vocational approaches, as well as in middle school and high school, in order to reach 50% at least of our high schoolers who are studying sciences and 50% literature, before promoting even more scientific and technical education. Because the development of these startups, the young woman from Rwanda in the video clip was discussing this, and all of these new technologies and this new global orientation towards the Internet of Things, we will have to have people trained in school and capable to be fully cognizant of what we need in the global world. In terms of startups, we have created a delegation to create entrepreneurship for young people and women, which currently receives a grant of 50 billion CFA francs. And thanks to the support of the African Development Bank, and I thank them in their support in this pandemic, as well as the Islamic Bank and all the partners. And thank to their action, the African Development Bank, today we had more than $200 million roughly that we could contribute to the financing of startups, the financing of women's empowerment, without requesting any guarantees that the young people do not have. And projects such as these will allow us to support this innovation for African youth, which is a youth that is innovating and has shown its entrepreneurship, but they need the support of this country, because conventional banks do not finance projects without guarantees. So we need partnerships, public-private partnerships, and the support of state. But education needs to be at the basis of our efforts. And I will stop there and let my colleagues intervene. President Issoufou. President Issoufou, you have the floor. Is it me? Yes, you have the floor, President Issoufou. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Before answering your question on education, I want to remind you that in Niger as well, we have set up, and faced with the health crisis, a response plan to the tune of $2.2 billion, which will seize fiscal measures to support SMEs, as well as a support plan for vulnerable population. And for the time being, Niger has had 9 cases, and we have had 75 people who died, and we are trying to contain the pandemic, and we are succeeding with the social distancing measures that we have set up. Regarding youth, our continent, as you know, is characterized by its demographic structure with a very young population. The median age of our population is 19, and this youth of the population is both an asset and a major challenge. It will only become an asset when we will be capable to transform this demographic asset. And we need to educate, take care of our young people. And in the framework of our program that we are setting up in Niger, our ambition is to increase the percentage of young people towards science and to reach 40%. Since we need to keep in mind that in emerging and developing countries, this ratio is 60%. It was 8% only in Niger in 2011, and we will reach 40% by 2021, which will allow us to improve how employable young people will be. Generally speaking, in Africa, in the job market, we have to make space for 10 million young people every year. And these may be 30 million in 2040 or 2050. And we need to create jobs, find jobs for all of this youth that is arriving on the job markets. So we need to implement the 2063 agenda in the programs that favor integration. And as a consequence, we need to allow to create employment that is requested for our youth. So we need to accelerate, after COVID, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which should have been implemented in June, but unfortunately COVID has forced us to postpone the calendar. We are thinking about the new timeline. But outside of this continental free trade area, there are other plans of the 2063 agenda on which we need to insist. The plan for infrastructure in Africa. Africa needs railroads, Africa needs energy, Africa needs airport, port infrastructure, etc. And all of this will create jobs. We need to develop our industry because Africa should not continue to be merely an exporter of raw goods. As long as we continue to do this, we will not create enough jobs for our youth. We need to transform raw goods, have processing to create jobs for these young people who will arrive in their millions on the job market. We also should further develop agriculture. We are importing $50 billion of grain every year for Africa. We have the highest percentage of agricultural land in the world. So we need to insist on agricultural development. So Africa has many assets. And after COVID, we will have to accelerate this integration, and the solution to the problems for our youth today can be found in integration. Thank you, President. President Ouattara, if you will allow me, I fully agree with what my predecessors have just said, and I want to insist to say to our youth that they need to continue to keep hope. I believe that this pandemic has shown clearly that the strategy that my administration is carrying out is the right one, to insist on education and healthcare. I don't want to come back on all of the details of what we have done in Côte d'Ivoire recently, but we have done as much as the 50 years preceding our administration. And in terms of healthcare, this pandemic leads us to increase the share of our expenditure, our spending in health, and to improve healthcare infrastructure. During the Ebola crisis, even though we had neighboring countries such as Guinea and in Nigeria, we didn't have a single case of Ebola in Côte d'Ivoire. Given the current evolution of the COVID pandemic, it also shows that the healthcare system is quite resilient. And I consider that this remains a priority. In terms of education, I fully agree with my colleague, President Macky Sall, that technical and technological training is the best approach. When I see all the startups that the young people are trying to create, and all of this was interrupted because of this pandemic, because of the curfew and social distancing, the difficulty of finding financing, all of this has affected our youth. Particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, we see that tourism and restaurants are a source of employment for young people who have therefore been greatly affected by this crisis. So this reminds us that we need to continue training our young people, give them technical training. And we have had a new laid down new cables thanks to technology that is homegrown and allowed to develop this. And education is our better investment. Our youth is our treasure, and we have to work to improve the conditions for young people. This, of course, should lead to finding them jobs, which requires a good economic policy and investments. It means that governments need to be able to find the right projects and to ensure that issues of governance receive the utmost priority, because it's by improving governance that we will improve investments and that we will create jobs for young people.
Merci,
thank you.
President Kenyatta, you wanted to react on this education or other questions asked by the youth.
Thank you very much. And if you will allow me, I just want to go back to the previous subject that we were discussing, because indeed, as we are talking about this new world order, I also wanted just to say that I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those of the developed countries, especially President Macron, who has been in the forefront of saying that there is a need for this new world order, of saying that there is a need to support the most vulnerable nations, and I just wanted that point to come across. Secondly, to say that in Kenya, technology has played a huge role in changing the way we do things. Mobile money, mobile telephony has really changed the way in which Kenyans have transacted with each other, especially over the last 10 years. And as a result of that, a few years ago, we ourselves began the process of changing our curriculum to a much more competence-based curriculum, a competence-based curriculum that arms our young people with the skills that they require to face the challenges and the job market of the 21st century. And that's why when you hear of a lot of these young people who are doing deliveries, others, we in Kenya, for example, are using the mobile telephone system to distribute funds to the most vulnerable in our community. Virtually every single individual has a phone. It is creating greater transparency. And we are also seeing very many startups, because we must also look at it from that perspective. As a result also of the lockdowns that we have had, we have seen very many new startups that have come up using technology, using the internet to provide goods and services to people who have been locked in rooms. So it has also created opportunities and shown the great possibilities that exist, especially for our young people, through the use of technology with the right training to create opportunities, not only for employment, but also for growth of our economies in the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And I would just but encourage and say that I am very keen to work in partnership with these great young people who, as everybody who is participating today, my fellow colleagues have acknowledged, they actually are not the future of our continent. They are the present. They are the majority. They are the ones who are there today. And mine is to say, let us work together in solidarity. Let us push our economies forward. Let us create these new opportunities. Let us forge together and make this continent, this youthful continent, the continent of tomorrow.
Thank you, President Kenyatta. My question to all of you as a conclusion, and I will start with President Issoufou. If you have in one sentence an advice to give to the G20 countries, what will be this advice? Please, Monsieur le Président Issoufou.
President Issoufou, what advice would you give to the G20, which is meeting in a few months in Riyadh? Thank you, Richard. In a few words, what I could say is that there will be before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. It is extremely important for the world to think about a new paradigm. This new paradigm should be based on certain values: solidarity, equity, freedom, and dignity. This is extremely important. As I was saying before, it is important that we find resources. There are many resources in the world, but they need to be better shared inside of countries and among countries. And therefore, we need to move things along and create the right conditions in order to be able to implement this new paradigm.
President Bio, if you have an advice to give to the G20 countries, the G20 group, which will meet soon, the world leaders, what will be this advice, Mr. President?
I think we have to be frank with Africa and support Africa to go through this particular pandemic in a way that we can resume normal activities again. But quite apart from this, I couldn't use my time to talk about education. If you can just give me 1 minute, I should be able to do so. We consider human capital development as very important for our development as a nation. And the best way you can develop the human being is by education, investment in education. And that investment must be fit for purpose. As we loom, as the fourth industrial revolution is looming, that education has to be fit for purpose. So what type of education do we give to our youth, especially taking into consideration the youth bulge, so that they are not a problem or a challenge in the future? It means that we have to educate them in a way that we can lead the fourth industrial revolution. We should not be at the receiving end. So even with all what is happening, what we have done is to make sure that using radio, television, the current technologies that are here, we are using everything to make sure that we can deliver education to all the remote areas in the country that we can reach. So Africa should endeavor to make sure that every effort is made to give quality education, especially with the prediction that we are going to have a very high population in Africa. We should make sure that that population is fit for purpose by making sure that we invest in education, that we place them ahead of the queue, so that we are not just consumers, but also Africa should be able to lead and take part in the fourth industrial revolution in a meaningful way. Thank you.
President Kenyatta, your message that you shared on stage in Riyadh last October still resonates in my mind. What will be your next message to our friend who will meet soon in Riyadh from the G20?
To our friends in the G20, I have one very simple message. Africa is not the problem, but through partnership, we can be part of the solution. Period.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
President Macky Sall, what messages would you share with the leaders of the G20, and you take part in these meetings quite regularly?
Voilà. Merci beaucoup. En fait,
Thank you very
c'est
much.
un message d'espoir,
Well, this would be a message of
un
hope,
message de partenariat réaffirmé.
a message of partnership.
On peut considérer l'économie
We can consider
et la finance comme
that
une fin en soi,
economy and finance are not an end in and of themselves, that they're just a means
le progrès
to finding a
de
solution,
l'homme.
to improving the well-being of mankind, which is why we're making this appeal to a new world order that places mankind at its core. The G20 does have the means to support us.
Ce plateau, il ne s'agit pas
We have said this before. We're not begging here.
il s'agit de mécanismes
We need to have the right mechanisms that will allow us all together to overcome our difficulties. And this is the message that I would share with my friends from the G20. President Ouattara, you have the last word. What advice or what comments would you make before a G20 in November, and what conclusions would you give? Thank you. I want to say that we have a common position of the African Union, as expressed by our brothers who represent us at that level, and we are in full solidarity. And I believe that the key word, as President Uhuru Kenyatta was saying, is solidarity and partnership. And Africa is the continent of the future, and I believe that some are understanding this. Everyone needs to realize this, and which is why it is good to have this partnership to continue forging ahead, and so that the world can become a place where we can all live in peace, but also in security. And to conclude, I would like to thank you, my dear friend Richard Attias, for having organized this video conference on behalf of my brothers. Since I am the eldest in age, the age in Africa is important. I would like to, on behalf of all of us, tell you that we are grateful for this opportunity to discuss together, and thank my brothers for the exchanges that we have had, which were extremely fruitful. I believe that Africa has drawn the lessons of this pandemic. I believe that this opens opportunities for us to insist on health, and we do this already, but we need to continue because we now have the support of the international community. We need to continue to place health as well as education and technical training for our youth at the core of our activities, to ensure that young people keep hope and remain in Africa, in their own continent, to help to develop their countries. And I believe that the situation with COVID is quite difficult for the world. It is difficult in Africa, of course, due to the weaknesses of our healthcare systems, but we nonetheless have very low mortality rates, and we have a lot of people who get better, maybe because we have all taken anti-malarial drugs when we were young, or because our population is quite young compared to other countries. But that is not enough. We need to encourage our scientists and our experts to find drugs and homegrown solutions adapted to our future life in case there were future pandemics. We never know, other pandemics could happen, so that in the continent we have human resources, our own human resources, to overcome these difficulties. I'm very proud of the medical experts in Côte d'Ivoire and in many African countries, because the medical sector has confronted full on the issue and has worked tirelessly, and the results have been quite good. Of course, we all want to overcome this pandemic, and we have not done what the Europeans have done, or what has been done in the United States. If we avoided quarantine, in most cases it's because it's contrary to our culture. We live in society, and we have adapted our fight against the pandemic to our own culture, and we have had curfews from time to time. We have tried to separate various regions from the other, but we have not separated human beings while supporting social distancing and putting in place the right measures. This was important to overcome this issue of COVID. I would like to conclude by thanking Richard for your staff and your experts that allowed us to have this discussion, because without them it would not have been possible. And we hope that despite the fact that this was fruitful, what we are hoping is to see you personally in Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm sure this is true for the other countries as well. And I hope our countries will continue in good health, and I wish them good prospects for the future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, President Ouattara. You said a word that is very important that I will come back to for the last transition. You spoke about culture, President, and I believe that despite this crisis, I believe that it is important to continue to support our African culture. So the words of conclusion will be given to a daughter of our continent who is a goodwill ambassador with UNICEF, our sister, Angélique Kidjo.
I would like to highlight the African culture, and I will give the floor to our sister, the Goodwill Ambassador of UNICEF, Angélique Kidjo. Merci à vous. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies. Merci à tous. Angélique, the floor is yours. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.